So I think we're live. Is that okay?
Yes.
So girls, is everything okay in YouTube? So we're live. So good morning to all of you. Welcome to the very first International Conference on Henry James Studies. My name is Natasha Costa. I am a professor at the Federal University of Jataí, Brazil. This online event is an initiative of the Henry James Study Group, which is the first Brazilian research group dedicated to James's works. Our goals are to stimulate the reading of the Jamesian fiction and nonfiction works and to promote the academic research on his legacy. And to help us achieve these goals, there is no better scholar than Professor Greg Zacharias, whom I have the honor to introduce to you today as our opening keynote speaker. Greg Zacharias holds a PhD in English and American Literature from New York University. He also has an MA in English and American Literature from New York University and received a BA in English and American University, magna cum laude, from New York University. Greg is a leading Henry James scholar who was named Nebraska Professor of the Year in 2014. He has always been a champion of undergraduate research and a valued professor at Creighton University. Greg founded the Center for Henry James Studies in 1996 and is the co-general editor and project director of the Complete Letters of Henry James, a monumental series transcribing, editing, annotating, and publishing over 10,000 manuscripts from James's papers, one of the largest literary letters projects in history. So I met Greg in 2015 when he generously welcomed me to Omaha at the James Center for my split PhD studies. I was privileged to see Greg's committed work and his thoughtful consideration for his students. Greg's talk today, entitled Henry James and History, will shed light on James's very peculiar relationship to history and how it influences his writings. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Natasha, for the really great and generous, kind introduction. It's so nice to see you again. And congratulations for organizing this meeting and doing so much to encourage Henry James studies around the world. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. Just one note before I begin. In this paper, I use the term recordo that might not be completely familiar to everyone. It's a word like souvenir, meaning something that is kept or remembered to remind the owner of an experience and used to bring that experience back to awareness. I use the term recordo because it has special importance in James's late novel, The Golden Bowl, in relation to novel characters' fictional histories and futures. It has importance outside that novel too. History is an important term in Henry James's thinking and vocabulary. Understanding it gives insight to James's autobiography and to his novels. James's completed autobiographical volumes, A Small Boy and Others, and Notes of a Son and Brother, his journals and notebooks, and his more than 10,000 letters provide much of the surviving narrative of his life. The way he represents his history for others in letters and autobiographies, and for himself in his journals and notebooks, describe implicitly and explicitly Henry James's conception of history. Having a sense of James's use of history for representing his own past, in turn, helps us understand his novels because James used the term history regularly as a way to explain his aims for fiction. For example, in The Art of Fiction, James contends that the novel is history. That is the only general description which does it justice that we may give of the novel. Scholarship has not overlooked the relation of history to James's fiction and nonfiction. Rosalind Jolly opens Henry James' History, Narrative, Fiction by asserting the fundamental relationship between fiction and history in James's writing. Jolly notes that James himself asserted the relationship, since at least his 1867 review of Anne Manning's two novels, The Household of Sir Thomas More and also Jacques Bonneval. Jolly also reminds us that James expressed the relation of history to fiction most famously in his 1883 essay on Anthony Trollope, when James declared, "It is impossible to imagine what a novelist takes himself to be unless he regard himself as an historian and his narrative as history. It is only as an historian that he has the smallest locus standi." At the same time, Jolly cautions us to remember that James was not alone in claiming fiction's relation to history. It was a convention of Victorian fiction and before, and James participated in it. When James stated in The Art of Fiction that the only reason for the existence of the novel is that it does attempt to represent life, he showed the logic that enabled him to maintain an analogy between the novel and history, both of which aim to represent a certain kind of truth, because both the novel of the day and history rely on similar sense-making strategies. Yet there is more to think about when considering James's representation of history. He does more with the concept than mimic in his fiction some conventions of historical discourse as a way to remain current with the fashion of the day. In a collection he edited, titled Enacting History in Henry James from 2002, Gert Bullens makes two important points that extend Jolly's analysis of James's use of history in his fiction. The first point is this: the history that Henry James's narratives may be said to enact is that history as events that is itself inaccessible to narration or cognition, but open to rehearsal and reiteration at a performative level. The reader's hermeneutical impulse to gain unmediated access to the events that constitute this history will remain frustrated inasmuch as it is a desire to grasp an object that is essentially elusive. The reader may, for one part, attempt to make such events cognitively accessible by transforming them into history as narrative, into a knowable and explicable past. Bullens' second point that is important to me today is this: Jamesian narrative demands of the reader not just an emotional responsiveness, but also an ethical assumption of responsibility for the history that is enacted, for the event that takes place in the process. Bullens' recognition that James's history engages readers so that each reader must, in Bullens' words, make it one's own by repeating it imaginatively, is important to James's writing of both history and fiction. As a consequence of readers internalizing the narrative of that history or that fiction, of making it, so to speak, one's own, Bullens finds that Jamesian history carries an ethical dimension, which Bullens describes as, quote, an ethical assumption of responsibility for the history that is enacted, for the event that takes place in the process. From Bullens' description of the process of James's history, I infer not only an engagement with readers for what has happened, but also for the shaping of expectations for what could happen. Thus, the Jamesian past attempts to establish a point of orientation that directs a journey to the future. More, the future Bulens finds in James's history has a goal. It is to shape a future that is less contestatory, more cooperative, and more civilized. In addition to Bulens's identification of the future dimension of Jamesian history, he locates a second crucial feature I hope to develop. And that second feature is, in Bulens's words again, that conscious characters in James are invariably associated with loss and with deprivation. That conscious characters in James are invariably associated with loss and deprivation. For the rest of my time today, I will try to explore the relationship between Jamesian history, consciousness, hurt, including loss and deprivation, and the future. The descriptions of history in James that Jolly and Bulens discuss are important, but there is something more to say about the way James represents history. His use of objects, both material and remembered, to signify and thus find a pathway to the past. In the following passage from one of James's autobiographical volumes, A Small Boy and Others, James shows how history, the future, and consciousness are represented by and thus contained in remembered objects, special things, which James called any contributive particle. Each of those particles could also be called a recordo. James articulates that relationship between memory of things, and what the thing under discussion in the autobiography is an advertising poster, and he refers to the advertising poster in the following passages. So he articulates the relationship between memory of things and history in this way. Still others of these, he's talking about these remembered images, break in upon me, and they refuse to be slighted, reconstituting, as I practically am, the history of my fostered imagination, for whatever it may be worth. I won't pretend to a disrespect for any contributive particle. I left myself just above, that is above in the text. I left myself just above, staring at the Fifth Avenue poster, and I can't but linger there while the vision it evokes insists on swarming. The poster, James recalls, evokes. It calls back memories. The memories populate a vision that captures James. Remember, his being captured by yet another set of memories, all evoked by the poster, which serves as a recordo, a kind of a gateway to the past. In James's fiction, special objects that open doors to the past appear, as they do especially in The Golden Bowl, as recordi. The gilded cup from which the novel gets its title is such a recordo. In The Wings of the Dove, the Bronzino portrait serves as a recordo for Millie Thiel, and Millie's letter at the end of the novel is one for Kate Croy. In the story The Jolly Corner, Spencer Bryden apprehends in a dream or hallucination a recordo of himself as he might have been. One of Isabel Archer's recordi in The Portrait of a Lady is comprised of memories of Gilbert Osmond and Madame Merle in physical relation to one another that can only signify their intimacy. So too Strethers' recordo of Chad Newsom, coatless, boating with Madame de Villeneuve in The Ambassadors, and on throughout James's fiction. In James's autobiographical writing, his writing desk, seen in memory with the payment of his first professional writing job, supplies the recordo of his humiliation of himself to himself, of the way he allowed money to seduce him into compromising his art. And the American scene is filled with recollected memories represented by a series of less than flattering names for the author's remembered self, such as the restless analyst, which is by far the most frequently given name. But there are 19 others. Each name constitutes a particular recordo, a particular history and future for the narrator. These recordi serve James as ways to establish lines of history, paths to the future, and particular deployments of consciousness, ways of seeing and knowing experience. They indicate a particular conception of history for James, and James's history, in many instances so like our own, is marked by trauma and by injury. Trauma and injury make for good fiction, as we all know, because they result from conflict, and many readers enjoy the way conflict shapes story space. Because trauma and injury serve as life-changing events for fictional characters, they are useful for building exciting and engaging stories. Trauma and injury thus have important places in James's novels. James's Hyacinth Robinson from The Princess Casamassima is not only hurt by his rejection and loved by the princess, Christina Light. His heritage of a noble father and a revolutionary mother, he believes, through his own remembered history, forces internal injury, self-destruction, and finally leads to his suicide. Roderick Hudson's disappointments, mistakes, and traumatic experiences lead to his death. In Washington Square, Catherine Sloper's pain, like Isabel Archer's, and in a different way, Lambert Strether's, doesn't produce death. But the conclusion of her novel, like the conclusion of The Portrait of a Lady and The Ambassadors, as well as The Golden Bowl and so many others, shows her in anything but a happy state. The novel that is Washington Square, ends with this description. Catherine Sloper, meanwhile, in the parlor, picking up her morsel of fancy work, her embroidery, had seated herself with it again, for life, as it were. Catherine Sloper's history is representative, so is Isabel Archer's. Thus, in The Portrait of a Lady's great chapter 42, Isabel Archer becomes aware of a recordo, a deep hurt from the past engineered by Gilbert Osmond, her husband, and meditates on it. She tells herself stories about its meaning. That history then offers a future. James's narrator thus communicates Isabel Archer's meditation. Then the shadows had begun to gather. It was as if Osmond deliberately, almost malignantly, had put the lights out one by one. The dusk at first was vague and thin, and she could still see her way in it, but it steadily deepened. And if now and again it had occasionally lifted, there were corners of her prospect that were impenetrably black. These shadows were not an emanation from her own mind. She was very sure of that. She had done her best to be just and temperate, to see only the truth. They were a part, they were a kind of creation and consequence of her husband's very presence. She knew of no wrong he had done. He was not violent. He was not cruel. She simply believed he hated her. Kathy Carruth offers a framework in unclaimed experience, trauma, narrative, and history we could adapt for understanding James's representation of history in his autobiographical writing and novels. Carruth's framework also accounts for Jamesian history in the ways that Jolly and Bulens understand it. In addition, Carruth explains why many cultures organize their histories in relation to national traumas. Carruth's understanding of the way trauma and representation find their place in historical narrative suits an analysis of James's conceptualization and representation of history in his novels and autobiographical writing. The summary of Carruth's understanding of how trauma relates to history is this. Trauma, whether personal or national, has no place to go in the psyche. It is experience that we resist claiming. We resist defining, placing, and containing trauma in memory in order to keep the trauma, in Carruth's way of explaining it, in mind as the experience itself. When that trauma is in mind and reemerges, as upsetting as the reemergence may be, the subject realizes that they are alive and no longer in the situation of the original trauma. Ironically, the torment of the recurrent trauma, which might have involved even the death of someone close to the subject, becomes a reminder of the subject's life and survival. When the trauma's return is over for the moment, when the traumatic re-experience departs, the subject is left with the conviction that the trauma is a reminder not only of the pain of the past, but also of the fact that the subject is still alive. As a reminder of life, trauma's reemergence becomes difficult to want to abandon. Psychic and even physical survival thus depend on our not being able to place trauma in memory, which results in its persistent reemergence into consciousness as anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares. Carruth continues, however, that the encoding of trauma in narrative or another representation of what has been seen but cannot be contained, and its transmission, the transmission of trauma to others rather than its understanding, is a way to relieve trauma's pain. As Carruth explains the importance of the telling, the passing on does not consist in the knowledge of a death that could simply be seen, but in the transmission of precisely an act of awakening from death. In the opening of the other's eyes, the awakening consists not in seeing, but in handing over the seeing it does not and cannot contain to another and another future. But the transmission of the seeing of the trauma is not only the beginning of history. In that very transmission of the seeing and the awakening of consciousness of trauma, but not in explaining its meaning, in the establishment of history to relieve the recurrence of the trauma, the telling also establishes a future for others. The establishment of the future, Carruth explains, is also the articulation of history. For Carruth, and this is why I believe trauma and its transmission are so prevalent in James, trauma, this is Carruth's idea, trauma is, quote, the origin of consciousness itself, because it provokes awareness of one's ethical relation to others. This is why James's most aware characters, as Bulens asserts, are always associated with loss and deprivation. This is why James's most aware characters become so conscious of their own histories. This is why James himself is so driven to tell his own history. Henry James seems to have perceived the very relationships of trauma, history, consciousness, and ethics that Carruth maps, but with a difference. Where Carruth is mostly concerned with how trauma and consciousness produce an ethics of history for a group of people or for a nation, James attends to the individual. Those individuals in James are characters in fiction, as well as the stories of seeing and awakening he gives himself as a character in his own narratives, his own histories. James's seeing and awakening, his consciousness, like that of so many of his characters, is fundamentally melancholic, brooding, and inner-directed. It is that melancholic imagination that fosters his sharing of the dynamics of consciousness with the otherness of himself, as it were, rather than, as in Carruth's figuration, sharing the awareness with other individuals. James's melancholic imagination that is so aware of its own trauma, or the potential for its own trauma, appears, for example, in one of his best-known notebook entries. Following his return to the United States from England late in 1881, James began in Boston on 25 November, and in a never-before-used writing book he carried with him from London, what became a long 8,300-word entry, which he finished on 20 December in New York. In that long entry, as one does in journals and notebooks, James wrote to himself. He didn't, that is, write for himself to keep records, for example. He wrote to himself. He addressed himself. He told stories to and reviewed experiences for himself, as if one part of his imagination were speaking to and about another. Thus, James, a teller and writer, transmits the story of trauma to himself as reader and listener. In doing so, as Carruth outlined, he established both a history and a future. Thus opens the journal entry. If I should write here all that I might write, I should speedily fill this as yet unspotted blank book, bought in London 6 months ago, but hitherto unopened. It is so long since I have kept any notes, taken any memoranda, written down my current reflections, taken a sheet of paper, as it were, into my confidence. Meanwhile, so much has come and gone, so much that is now too late to catch, to reproduce, to preserve. I have lost too much by losing, or rather by not having acquired the note-taking habit. It might be of great profit to me, and now that I am older, that I have more time, that the labor of writing is less onerous to me, and I can work more at my leisure, I ought to endeavor to keep, to a certain extent, a record of passing impressions, of all that comes, that goes, that I see and feel and observe. To catch and keep something of life, that's what I mean. Here I am back in America, for instance, after 6 years of absence, and likely while here to see and learn a great deal that ought not to become mere waste material. The journal entry that follows this opening is important because it contains passages many have used to characterize the novelist. These very lines have become James's history. The following sentences, for example, could serve as an emblem of James's immigration to England, thus to Europe, and his consequent success as a novelist. They also transmit his awakening to the shock of dislocation and alienation from his home. I am 37 years old. I have made my choice, and God knows that I have now no time to waste. My choice is the old world, my choice, my need, my life. Another passage from the same entry highlights the nature of James's commitment to England/Europe and to the life of a professional fiction writer, when James declared to himself that one must choose either the old world or the new one. No European writer is called upon to assume that terrible burden, and it seems hard that I should be. The burden is necessarily greater for the American. He must deal, more or less, even if only by implication, with Europe, whereas no European is obliged to deal in the least with America. These communications with himself are signals of what James would seek to achieve for the rest of his life. They are James's discussion with and about himself of how he understood his relation to his past and his future as he wrote. They are impressions provoked by a life he was facing again in the United States, would leave behind, but would never forget. They encode and transmit trauma. The long 25 November to 20 December journal entry, so important to an understanding of James's historical identity, so important to an understanding of his identity, is also important for James's less remembered melancholy, and this is James's word he uses in the same passage, for James's less remembered melancholy meditation on his 6-year absence from the United States. We learn from the journal that those 6 years away from his home and family were important to James's professional development and personal growth. They also transmit personal hurt. During that time away from home, he established himself in London and made himself known as a respected and sought-after professional fiction writer and critic. James's melancholy relation to the past, then, is different from the one Freud describes in Mourning and Melancholia, where through the successful process of mourning, one releases oneself from an attachment to the past. As James describes in the journal, his past, especially the traumas of the past, remains with him through his awareness and naming of them. His melancholy relation to the past enables him to use it as part of his identity, and at the same time, as part of the changes to that identity, it enables him to tell of the past. It enables him to claim the past. And by listening to that telling, it enables him to establish a future. I use melancholy not as the medicalized term melancholia. I use it the way James and others used it, as a term related to pensiveness, introspection, self-objectification, and meditation. As Robert Burton noted so long ago in The Anatomy of Melancholy, fear and grief need not be components of melancholy. Instead, melancholy can be a way of learning and knowing. As Burton wrote, quote, "They get their knowledge by books, I mine by melancholizing." Jonathan Flatley offers a conceptualization of melancholy that seems close to James's as well as to Burton's own melancholizing, when Flatley observes that, quote, "Some melancholias are the opposite of depressing, functioning as the very mechanism through which one may be interested in the world." Thus, Flatley further imagines how melancholy functions for some as a way of learning and knowing. Flatley's conceptualization overlaps Carruth's explaining of how telling the experience of trauma enables its relief and establishes a history and a future. Flatley's attention to the way memories of objects function in the melancholic imagination accommodates the significance of the recordo in James. And here's Flatley. In the melancholic state, the world becomes a set of objects with no necessary function or meaning. The object world has been emptied of significance, and in this sense, it has also been prepared for allegorical transformation. The melancholic state of mind, then, even as it dwells on ruins and loss, is at the same time liberated to imagine how the world might be transformed, how things might be entirely different from the way they are. Melancholy, adds Flatley, serves as a mechanism of, quote, self-distancing that allows one to see oneself as if from the outside, end quote. Although James's melancholy imagination inclines him to be sensitive to the return of hurt, of trauma, melancholic self-evaluation also enables him to inspect his memories. It provides a means for James to develop stories for the memories and then to change parts of himself related to those memories. It enables him to give them a history and to give himself a future. A number of the impressions James recalled, named, considered, and wrote about in the journal while in his, quote, melancholy mood, end quote, are surprising and remarkable. And they seem to have surprised James too, when they returned to his awareness and reminded him of difficult moments in his past. For example, he recalled that his decision to live in Paris rather than London in 1875 and 1876 was due to, quote, all sorts of obstacles, end quote, in London that had discouraged him from living there. At the same time, he seems to have realized, as he wrote to himself about facing that recollection, that I wonder greatly now, in the light of my present knowledge of England, that these obstacles should have seemed so large, so overwhelming and depressing as they did at that time. When a year later, I came really to look them in the face, they absolutely melted away. Crucial here is that James is giving a history to what was, quote, overwhelming and depressing, end quote, about his past results in the, quote, melting away, end quote, of those obstacles. His, quote, facing, end quote, is the same as his awareness of them, his awakening to them. Also crucial is that though what threatened is gone, the experiences remain with James in another state, they're no longer threats, as he recollects, names, and then produces a written recordo, a history of what he feared and also overcame. The naming of those memories and his overcoming now remain in the journal as writing. In Carruth's terms, the journal passages are a passing on of the moment of awakening from trauma. Once threatening aspects of life have become part of him, his identity, and how he represented himself to himself. The particular status of that memory, now recalled and re-remembered, passed on, transmitted, depends on James's melancholy, through which he recalls and remembers. Like the novelist from The Art of Fiction, to whom James recommends, try to be one of the people on whom nothing is lost. James's consciousness, like that of so many of his characters, catches everything. After catching experience, he converts it to history. James's preservation of memory as history overlaps with 2 points that David McWhirter made recently on James, memory, and melancholia. McWhirter's first point is that James clings less to what has been lost, the lost object, than to the experience of loss itself, whether it be personal or historical. He does not mourn his dead so much as he strives to keep his loss of them alive. And it is this determined, melancholic embrace of loss that Maisie, from what Maisie knew, figures in her act of looking back, that connects her fictional peers, and James himself to the value and necessity of feeling backward, identified and explored by Heather Love in her 2007 book of the same name. And that book is Heather Love's Feeling Backward, Loss in the Politics of Queer History. Feeling backward and James's embrace of loss as features of his own ongoing sense of himself, at least of his writing, are both important because the feeling backward and the embrace of loss are components of Jamesian history, the retelling of which to himself enables him to find a future. In the long journal entry, he feels backward. He faces, rewrites, and embraces the first part of his professional career as a way to use it in order to pass on to the next part of his career, thus his life. In addition, McWhorter offers a second point that is relevant to thinking about the journal entry and thus to Jamesian history. And this is from McWhorter. James's and his characters' refusal to simply get over it or move on are not signs of morbidity or depression, but a powerful means of capturing the texture of modern experience and of representing and critiquing modern history, a history, to borrow Jameson's famous phrase, that consists of what hurts. McWhorter's point that James's melancholy captures and critiques, especially that which hurts. By that capturing, what Carruth understands as retelling or transmission is relevant in a discussion of James's long journal passage and the autobiographies, at least. To McWhorter's analysis of James's representation of memory and melancholy, however, it is worth adding that James's memorialization of the experience as he creates a history from it enables him to gain agency over the experience and thus to use it as a part of his own development, as a map of his own future. James's effort to recall the past that he now knows he must leave, even after he commits to its commemoration, is significant. After first doubting in the long notebook entry that he can find the memories of impressions of the past 6 years because, quote, they are buried deep in my mind, end quote, he announces that, quote, they have become part of my life, of my nature, end quote. Thus it was that James's particular melancholic mourning, his own feeling backwards, that enabled him to, quote, retain the lost object in all of its unrecognizability, end quote. The lost object then becomes the claimed recordo of his own experience. It becomes a history and a future. Using Carruth's term, he has claimed them because he has found a way to tell them. Henry James's telling of his own history and the consequent mapping of a future finds a parallel in The Portrait of a Lady. In the portrait, Isabel Archer's confrontation with the recordo of her husband's, Osmond's, hatred of her provokes deeper consideration of the place of that ruined relationship in her future. Her confrontation produces, that is, knowledge not only of him, but also of herself. The knowledge is, of course, embarrassing. Its reawakening hurts. Its truth forces a blush. The blush testifies to her awareness of her humiliation. And here's the passage from Portrait. Isabel's cheek burned when she asked herself if she had really married on a factitious theory in order to do something finally appreciable with her money. Osmond said to her one day that she had too many ideas and that she must get rid of them. He had told her that already before their marriage, but then she had not noticed it. It had come back to her only afterwards. This time she might well have noticed it because he had really meant it. The words had been nothing superficially, but when, in the light of deepening experience, she had looked into them, they had then appeared portentous. He had really meant it. He would have liked her to have nothing of her own but her pretty appearance. She had known she had too many ideas. She had more than he had ever supposed, many more than she had expressed to him when he had asked her to marry him. Important here is the way that Isabel's melancholizing takes her from a critique of Osmond's hatred of her to a prolonged meditation on her own nature, her past, and the opening to a new future as she communicates the trauma of her past to herself. Her facing never dislodges her sense of herself. She never condemns herself or ignores her situation. She accepts it, and in the transmission of the trauma to herself, finds a way to take what has been done and make a future. It's a kind of Jamesian revision, a reseeing of self that faces what has been done and uses it to produce a better version. James's remarks on his revision of the novel, for his New York edition in fact, map the same melancholy process that he shows in the journal entry and through Isabel Archer's chapter 42, by which trauma's story becomes history. Thus James wrote in the novel's preface, "Quite as interesting as the young woman herself at her best, do I find, I must repeat again, this projection of memory upon the whole matter of growth in one's imagination of some apology for motive." Here then is James's concise summary of the placement of trauma and its use as history, the relation of retrospection, meditation, self-analysis, and growth or development through a deliberate and considered rereading of one's past that can then enable revision and redirect the subject. Such revision and redirection then enables agency. James's prefaces to the New York edition are history-making acts through which both James and James's novels come to terms with themselves and their pasts, and also enable a future for those who receive the communications. Like Isabel Archer's vigil in chapter 42 of The Portrait of a Lady, and like the Ricordi in the autobiographies and notebooks, the New York edition prefaces represent an intimate and detailed reacquaintance with the past, an acceptance of it as something that continues as part of one's identity, and a commitment to communicate the story of what came before. Like the long journal entry from 1881, like all of James's history making, the prefaces are James's communications with himself as much as they are expositions about his novels. The following lines from James's preface to Roderick Hudson, the preface that opens James's great New York edition of his fiction, map further the pathway of that melancholic Jamesian process that always inquires, always observes, always accepts, always adjusts when possible, never denies, and always learns from what has been seen and has come to know. In that learning, then, is change and progress in figurative or in actual re-seeing, in revision. Crucial, too, in light of my attention to the long notes in James's journal, is his attention to the utility of what he calls in the passage I'll bring up in a second, the utility of the explorer's notebook. He sees the prefaces in some sense like an explorer's notebook, because the explorer's notebook serves the same function metaphorically as the journal. Note, too, in the following, the language of investigation, of measurement, of determination, of acceptance, and of the inability, finally, to make ultimate determinations that would stop further investigation. And James wrote in that first preface, everything counts. Nothing is superfluous in such a survey. The explorer's notebook strikes me here as endlessly receptive. This, accordingly, is what I mean by contributive value, or put it simply as, to one's own sense, the beguiling charm of the accessory facts in a given artistic case. This is why, reading over for revision, correction, and republication the volumes here in hand, I find myself all attentively in presence of some recording scroll or engraved commemorative table, from which the private character, moreover, quite insists on dropping out. These notes represent, over a considerable course, the continuity of an artist's endeavor, the growth of his whole operative consciousness, and, best of all, perhaps, their own tendency to multiply, with the implication thereby of a memory much enriched. This passage stands not only as an introduction to the New York edition, it stands too as a model of Jamesian history. As such a model, it describes his method for fiction writing and also for thinking about himself and the world around him. For as James strives to represent the consciousness of characters, so he strives to represent his own. In the passage I just read, and you still see, he makes no distinction between the two. More, the motive for the so-called art of representation, a phrase that appears just 13 lines into the edition's opening preface, has to do with questions, and therefore has to do with learning. It has to do with the past and with the future. It has to do with consciousness and the status of human relationships. That awareness of experience and learning finds the figurative record of its actions and achievement in the, quote, endlessly receptive explorer's notebook, end quote. James represents Isabel Archer's communication of her history, and thus of her future, in chapter 2 of The Portrait of a Lady. James's own awareness finds its place in his actual notebooks. Each kind of notebook carries experiences of the past to the melancholic's mind, which resees, it literally revises the past experience from a number of aspects, as James describes the process in the long passage I just read. That process of reseeing, of feeling backward, to return to Heather Love's term, and of working to find meaning in that feeling is not debilitating, it's not wounding, it's not shameful. Instead, for the melancholy mind, the revision of the past and the record of that revision as the establishment of history are the consequence of and a contribution to, as James wrote, the whole operative consciousness, and best of all, a memory much enriched. Thank you for listening to me. I can't hear you though, Natasha.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. Now we will select some questions here for you. We have a comment here. Greg Zacharias is an inspiration.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you so much. You're an inspiration, everybody.
Then we have this first question here. Professor Greg, you discussed how a recorder is not merely a static, concrete object or a name, but something that conveys an abstract aspect, such as the experience of trauma.
Yes.
Is this reflection correct?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Maybe I would just add to that I think the way you phrased it is exactly right. That in a sense the experience of trauma would be then a remembered story one tells oneself about the trauma. I think it's the telling that converts the trauma, the pain of trauma, into in a sense, the remembered abstract object. So I think the remembered telling is important.
Okay, thank you. We have another one here by Sarah. We know that note-taking was a very important part of James's process of writing. I'm wondering how it changed and if it changed when he had to adopt dictation to compose his novels and short stories. Would you please tell us a little bit about this change? Did James continue taking notes, or did he also have to quit this practice due to his rheumatism?
He kept taking notes. He has long notes in the notebooks that remain, even after he started dictating in the late 1890s. He still talks to himself in the notebooks. But the kind of question about, or at least I infer from the question, a sort of secondary question, did the dictation also function as a kind of note-taking? Because his typical work strategy during the dictation time was to dictate in the morning and then to read over the dictation, the typed out dictation, and make corrections to it. So in a sense, the dictation became a record of the story he told in the morning. So I think, at least in that sense, his note-taking or quasi-note-taking, note-taking through dictation, right, changed his work habits through the dictation. And sometimes he also, to relieve the pain through the rheumatism or the carpal tunnel syndrome, whatever pain he had from writing, sometimes he would dictate letters. But then he would also make some revisions in the letters, sometimes adding things that were too personal for him to share with his typist, things like that. So I think it's a really great question, and one that I'm sure people who've studied James's dictation think about it as a kind of note-taking. But I think you're exactly right that the dictation functioned as an analog to note-taking, where he could look at again a kind of a transcript of the stories he had told earlier that day or the day before, or whenever he did the dictation. But to sort of reiterate, the regular note-taking remained, even though he didn't do so much writing, but he still did writing even after he started dictating. He still wrote a lot. He hand wrote letters. He dictated some, but he just stopped for the most part writing the published material. So really, really nice question.
Thank you, Greg. We have another one here. I made this one. for you. So Professor Zacharias, in the preface to the Golden Bowl, James suggests reducing the readers to a state of hallucination. They become systematically bewildered and bamboozled. So do you think that Jamesian history is one of the ways to create this hallucinatory state? So this came to mind because you mentioned that history can be something elusive and inaccessible.
I think that this is true, and especially in the very late fiction. I think sometimes we kind of know that in literary history, late James is somehow seen as proto-modernist. And one of the, again, we could talk a long time about this, but I kind of put this out here in relation to your really nice question. One of the functions of modernism is to defamiliarize the reader, right? I mean, and so in a certain sense, if at least the late fiction tends to produce a state of bamboozlement, right? That's also a state of defamiliarization, I think. And through at least the process would be through defamiliarization, we're really forced to reorganize our thoughts. We're forced to become more conscious of our world and more conscious of how we process the world. So I think that's really part of, especially late Jamesian fiction. I mean, who could really deny that? What think about the long tower metaphor in the beginning of the second book of the Golden Bowl, for example. I mean, it's like a 2-page paragraph, and you wonder, like, what is going on? What is the narrator talking about, right? What is this tower that we're walking around? How am I supposed to understand this long, long metaphor if that's not a state of bamboozlement, of defamiliarization, of forcing readers really to become very conscious of how we're reading and how we're experiencing the story space, the world of the text, and also the details of the narration. I don't know what is, and I think he had to be, 100% aware of that.
There is one passage describing the antiquario in the Golden Bowl,
Yes.
And then there is one sentence until the period. There are around 140 words. That's one sentence. This is very defamiliarizing as well.
Very defamiliarizing. I know.
So Greg, we have another question here. Here, by Tatiana. Professor, would you say that James's characters acknowledge and identify that they have experienced trauma, or do they just present us this without realizing it?
I think the most conscious characters realize it, but some characters don't realize it. For example, I don't think the prince really understands himself. I think he understands his motives. He understands that he needs to survive, and he needs Adam Verver's money through Maggie Verver to survive. But I don't think he understands that, in a certain way, the trauma of his own dislocation, right? The trauma of the sacrifices of immigration that he's making and identity change that he's making, right? I don't know if Adam Verver, we don't really know enough about Adam Verver. If Verver understands in a sense, the sacrifices that he's made, the trauma of the loss of his wife, for example. In the Golden Bowl, there's a really nice, shortest chapter I think of as the autobiographical chapter of Verver's life, where we get some insight into Verver as a father, as a husband, and some of the changes that have occurred in his life, which would be traumatic for a person either rich, poor, or middle class. I don't know if James gives us enough of Verver to see whether he understands how those painful parts of his life have changed his life. So we only really know what what James allows us to see about the characters. But I think the central characters, and even a proto-central character like Catherine Sloper, James wrote one time that he wrote Washington Square to earn enough money to really fund the writing of The Portrait of a Lady, which followed immediately. He actually was writing two of them at the same time. But I think Washington Square is a kind of mental preparation for characters also in the portrait. So I think you can ask your good question of a little bit of Catherine Sloper, although we don't get indirect discourse of her thinking like we would in his next novel. But I think the short answer is the thinking characters, the characters we know are thinking, always get it. The other characters, some we know don't get it, some we don't know whether they get it or not. Madame de Villeneuve, for example, in The Ambassadors, I would think if there were a novel with Madame de Villeneuve at the center, she would get it, right? She would be able to somehow remember her experience and somehow use it for some positive growth, for dealing with the trauma and rewriting her past and her future. She seems to be a very thinking and thoughtful character, but we never really know. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. We have our final question here by Jessica. So James captured the essence of the human. I don't know James yet, but according to Greg, I believe the development of character is not only a positive aspect, but it would be real, like not only positive, but real. So could you tell us?
Could Jessica say a little bit more about that question? Do you mind, Jessica?
I think perhaps she's typing, but I think that she means that James shows. She excluded the question, but I think that she was aiming to understand a bit more about how things are not romanticized in James's works, but they are real. They show trauma. They show psychological development. So it's not something romanticized, like only the good aspects of life, but how life can be complex and difficult, and it demands growth.
I think that's really right, and I understand more now the term aspect positive. I think in the end, in James's sort of calculus of consciousness, the outcome is always positive in the sense that consciousness even of the painful, even of the negative, produces a positive outcome, right? But it's not always, in a sense, a happy outcome. Sometimes, and this is, I think, why Heather Love's formulation is so important. The feeling backwards and the full experience, even of the pain or the loss, and being able to somehow make it into a story that becomes part of a character's own story. Is Natasha is exactly what you're saying. It recognizes the complexity, the complexities of living. That involved in those complexities are things that are extremely hurtful, but in the calculation, they can become, in a sense, they can become helpful. Although in the helping, you still recognize that they still hurt. Jessica, is that okay, Jessica? You could give an icon, like thumbs up or something.
She said, yeah.
Oh, you're good, thank you.
So we don't have more questions here. Okay, so thank you so much, Greg, for this brilliant and inspiring talk. You propose important reflections concerning James's relationship to history. Your talk has certainly contributed to our understanding of the Jamesian legacy. So thank you for sharing your ideas with the Brazilian audience.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you and to talk with you and to listen to your questions and think about your questions. And congratulations for the group. And I hope that it continues with great energy. And I hope maybe one day I can return and listen and learn from you again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you,
I'd
Natasha.
like also to thank as well the organizing committee represented by Alice, Larissa, Leticia, Monica, Sara, and Tatiane, because without your partnership and collaboration, this event wouldn't exist. And thanks to all of you on YouTube. And finally, I'd like to invite you to join us in the panel about the portrait of a lady at 3 p.m. Brazil time, here on this YouTube channel. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.